there's been such an abuse of authority in Tasmania for so long, in every institution, whether it be Tasmanian police, whether it be the education department, most significantly the church. You know, when I wrote that song about the Port Arthur Massacre, I had an idea that this was a fishy situation, you know, but I didn't understand the full picture around everything. With the Port Arthur Massacre is because it wasn't handled properly, it wasn't explained properly, and they tried to shut it all down. And here we are, 29 years later, doing a podcast about it. You know, and people are like, why are you still talking about it? If they had done their job properly, we would not be talking about it, you know, and it's as simple as that.
Welcome to the WASP Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. This episode of the WASP Files features a very special guest with a unique perspective on the Port Arthur Massacre and the state of Tasmania itself, both as virtually a lifetime resident of Tasmania and also someone who, as a subversive artistic icon, has at times fallen on the wrong side of the tracks. He is a very articulate, passionate and spiritual man, and he wrote an award-winning rap song about Martin Bryant called A Question of Guilt. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you to our guest tonight, Greeley. The infamous Greeley, the famous Greeley, the controversial Greeley.
Yeah, my name's Andrew Greeley. I was born in America. My father is American. I came to Tasmania when I was only a couple months old. I was registered as an Australian citizen at the New York Embassy for Australia. But I came here when I was a few months old, and yeah, I spent a lot of my early childhood in Tasmania. A bit of my teenagehood back in America, and then a lot of my adult life in Tasmania. But yeah.
And that would have been a fairly wild, unruly place back then.
Yeah, it's very interesting to understand Tasmania in so many ways, through what the reality of the place is, and then through the narrative that is told of what the place is. And you know, my father, who, you know, grew up upstate New York, he grew up in a lot of different states. He came from a lot of generational abuse, and my grandmother went on the run with him into different states. And so my dad kind of, grew up in America like that. And under his impression of his experience in Tasmania in the 80s and the 90s was that there was no crime, it was peaceful, and there wasn't any drama, because that's what the news said, you know. And it's very interesting. There's a lot of people that think Tasmania is a very peaceful, wonderful, beautiful place, and there is a side of it that really is, you know. But there is another side of it that is, very dark, and it's very hard to explain and understand, especially when you're in it. It's taken me a lot on my lifelong journey to really understand that place. And especially, I'd say, in the last 5 years of my adult life, I've really, really tried to search for understanding, answers, and knowledge in regards to the complexity of what Tasmania is and being a Tasmanian. So,
Tasmania's always had that reputation. And you know, in some ways people laugh at Tasmania from the mainland, so to speak.
Yeah.
But what little I know about it is that it's sort of its own character, its own nature, and its own law, a law unto itself as well. And being so insular, that can have the peace and serenity and tranquility, but it can also create a very very toxic and protectionist and dangerous environment where it's
Yeah.
like whatever goes on in Tasmania goes on in Tasmania. You're not allowed to talk about it. If you step outside that, did you find that was the case? That it's like,
Yeah. Well, I think isolation in general, it affects the population. You know, when you look at the history of like Pitcairn Islands and places like that, yeah, humans have to survive in isolated places. You know, and stories of from places of isolation come with a lot of, yeah, I guess, severity in survival, all sorts of different things. You know, and Tasmania was, founded after Sydney. Sydney was the first place that was founded in the colony. Then they went to Tasmania before they had come to the rest of the mainland, you know. And so a big migration of convicts and, you know, soldiers all came to Tasmania. And then I think 1860 was when the gold rush kicked off. And really anyone that was about the hustle, anyone that was after money or had the smarts to get out, all moved to the mainland, you know, to make money and the gold rush and all that sort of stuff. And so when that was happening, Tasmania went into a massive depression, you know, because everyone was gone that, you know, was after the money and what was left behind. And so I know that like, it all adds in with the perspective on Tasmania. Historically, as it grows, there was a term that was used called the convict stain. And they referred to Tasmania as the convict stain. And I think maybe it's deeper in the Australian identity issue, is that because we came from convicts colonially, and the trauma and the shame and everything that was attached to that, you know, people wanted to get away from the convict stain. And they moved away from the reminder of their convict heritage, you know, which Tasmania was. Port Arthur being the beginning, you know, the symbol, I guess, for what is transportation in Australia, which is what built the Australian identity, you know.
Port Arthur was obviously, the penal colony was brutal place historically. And I often say that when I talk about the Port Arthur Massacre, that there are a lot of angry ghosts with their hands on the rifle that day.
Oh, yeah, it's when you're like, you know, like Hobart and Risdon Cove, which were the first places of settlement. That was 1803, 1804. They built Port Arthur around 1834. So the colony was there for about 30 years of figuring itself out, you know. And a lot of the people that had been brought in that colony for that first 30 years, they were convicts, you know what I mean? But they didn't have a place to put them. They were just slaves to the soldiers, you know. They'd find their different ways of being a convict, but it was still this early colony of figuring out, you know what I mean? And so after 30 years, they built Port Arthur and they started the mass transportation from, you know, England out to Port Arthur. But that also comes with so much different intersecting penal colonies, Norfolk Island, other different places that were similar places to Port Arthur, and people were getting shipped and moved around. You know, there were a lot of black convicts in Port Arthur that never get talked about, from different places in the world, all sorts of different things like that. So, yeah, you're looking at so much, deep cultural trauma in every way, you know. And I know the term generational trauma in Australia gets thrown around a lot, you know. And but the truth is that everyone in this country, in some way, it doesn't matter what class you're in, if you're in the highest class or the lowest class, there is some sort of elemental trauma that you're dealing with based on the circumstances just by being here, you know. And Tassie is a place that if you can learn about this and understand it, it can be a very haunting place in that sense, you know, because I see ghosts, and even what that term is unacknowledged spirit, you know. And that's the thing with spirit in a place where there has been mass trauma that isn't acknowledged and it's not honoured, it will keep circling around, you know. And I think this is a massive issue with just generational misery and disconnection in this country, is that there is collective spiritual trauma hanging around that needs to be acknowledged and needs to be processed, and truth needs to be told, for this to lift. And, it's very interesting that I'm here doing this podcast with you, Paul, because, I wrote a song about the Port Arthur Massacre, I think it was like 11 years ago, and it was at a time in my life where, I was really, really fixated on justice. I was really ignoring finding the own justice in my life, and I'd kind of focus on other justice, But Port Arthur Massacre is a situation that needs healing first and foremost, and the fact that this is even being talked about nearly 30 years after when it occurred is proof that there hasn't been healing, and yeah, so it's so interesting, man.
It's very much the impression I get. Everyone's telling us, leave it alone. The media will try and brush it under a rug. Anyone that wants to talk about it is very well, just not so much shut down, but there's a lot of vitriol that comes out about anyone that even dares to question what went on.
Yeah.
But the answer is, why? Why won't this go to bed? Why won't it be put to rest?
Yeah.
We've had all the proceeds, and he's locked away. Martin Bryant's locked away, never to be released. But there's still this ongoing, festering sore.
Yeah, it's an infection. And it's like, just like an infection, a physical one on your body, if you ignore it, it just gets worse, And I think, Tasmania has a history of suppression and oppression. When I wrote that song about the Port Arthur Massacre, I had an idea that this was a fishy situation, but I didn't understand the full picture around everything. That helps me understand why these things are still happening and why they're coming to the surface, But the more that, from what I understand, they shut down this Port Arthur Massacre, suppressed the documents because it was too traumatic. But once again, if the infection isn't dealt with,
it festers.
It festers. And here we are, people will point the finger at me like, you're doing this. And it's like I kind of really walked away from investing my life in understanding the truth of the Port Arthur Massacre. And ironically, more truth just kept coming, And, I just really want to see healing.
Being an artist. From, I guess you'd call it almost like the underground stream of hip hop and graffiti art, which is a subculture.
Yeah.
And a lot of it stems from, a place where the artists that propagate that level of art, there's conflict, there's drama, there's loss, there's anger, there's
100%.
So I guess tell us a bit about how you came to this beautiful, iconic, serene place called Tasmania as a kid, grew up there, and then you were young and found your way on your own path to art.
Yeah, well, hip hop for me, and this is, I think, hip hop for me was a truth that I needed. When I found hip hop, I felt like a lot of people in my life were lying to me. I felt like I was a kid that was to be seen and not heard, you know what I mean? Kept away. And at a young age, I realised that the powers that be that were trying to control me and the world around me, I grew up in a lot of religion in Tasmania through the Anglican Church. And a lot of my family trauma and trauma I went through came through the church. And so when I found hip hop, it was a freedom. It was like a fucking psh. It was like, something, this can be a vehicle of truth. And really from being that young kid that, I could really tell that I was surrounded by orchestration. Do you know what I mean? It's hard to explain. But through the church, I could tell that, things were being orchestrated and controlled in different ways. The churches owned the schools, it was all interconnected. I felt like I was trapped in my own little like world, and hip hop was freedom for that. And it's funny you say underground because graffiti I learned to paint in the tunnels underneath Hobart. So underneath Hobart, there's so many colonial tunnels that go in between Parliament House and up to the big park at the end of Salamanca. There's tunnels that go underneath the hospital, all sorts of different like Masonic tunnels to different areas. So I learned to do graffiti in those sort of areas, you know what I mean? Growing up and sneaking into the undergrounds of the old colony town. And
was it a sense of rebellion against what you were perceiving to be an institutionalised form of oppression and suppression?
It definitely was, yeah. It definitely was. It was a massive rebellion. Even before I found hip-hop, I was trying to rebel as much as I could, and I get kicked out of the churches for, running amok, and I wrote 666 on the wall at the church and got kicked out. I was just... Because, I was a traumatised kid that wasn't heard or understood, or no one would communicate with me in a way to help understand the pain that I was dealing with. They'd just kind of be like, nah, this is how it is. Everything's all good. Don't talk about it. Shut it down. It's a Tassie way, And then I found, hip-hop. And it was from the place where my dad's from, America. And, I was growing up without my dad. And I found this music and this art form from the place where he's from. And so I think that's where it just kind of clicked and just became my path of...
What age did you pretty much start kicking that off down in Tasmania?
Well, like I was into hip-hop from a very young age. So even just like when I think about it, it's been a part of my life since like I was about 9 years old. But it wasn't until I was about 14 that... we started like doing it at the youth centre in the middle of Hobart. There was like a place called Youth Arc, and we'd go in there and do graffiti workshops or do our own little concerts on the stage at the youth centre. And found other kids in the street that were in the same thing to me, and we started making graph crews and hip hop groups and coming together. And there was a small Tasmanian hip hop scene before I got into it, and I came in right at a generation where a bunch of guys my age were really into it, and it all just kind of went from there. But it's really still, this whole hip hop journey has been a path of searching for truth. Like I have so many friends that have come in and become successful rappers and got the fame and got the money and all the things that come with it. And it can turn your life around and it can make you successful, can give you these things. But for me, still, my journey of artistry is about finding truth, and the truth will set you free. So it's, once again, man, the fact that, I was very fascinated with the Port Arthur Massacre, and I'll explain how I became fascinated with it. As an artist was like, this is something that needs truth, and here we are.
And I guess, you're searching for the truth, as a lot of artists do, in a place, I haven't been down to Tasmania, but I'm getting a lot of insights from a lot of people who live there. That it's a place of lies, and that there is this dark undercurrent, and there is an institutionalised aspect to that place that that keeps a fairly iron and not very benevolent control over that little insular community, and that is causing a lot of pain.
On the day Port Arthur happened, I was 6 years old, so I was very young. And when I speak on Port Arthur, I want to tell my truth. I don't want it to come across like... Just my intention is to speak my truth, and... on the day that Port Arthur happened, I remember because I found a dead rat on the front doorstep of my mum's house. And it was a big rat. And then, by the afternoon, everyone was panicking. I just remember panic. The TV channel, there was only 4 channels on TV back then, maybe even 3. They were all kind of like shut down or, playing a certain narrative. And it was just lots of panic. But I don't really remember too much about the other circumstances when Port Arthur happened. But a few years later, 9/11 happened, you know. And then I started watching stand-up comedy as a young kid, and I was watching comedians talk about how 9/11 was a setup and how, you know, Bush knocked down the towers and this sort of stuff. And I was finding the same through hip-hop, you know, and it started to open my mind to the world and the possibilities of different narratives. You know, comedians were like, and this was right around the time, you know, 2001, war in the Middle East, 9/11, and I'd watch a comedian going, hold on, how come all the oil's there, you know, and these sorts of things. So as a young kid, I started to, okay, you know what I mean? It's different to what they're telling us.
Started to question.
Yeah. And then with Martin Bryant, it started with everyone saying, Marty, don't surf. And that's what I started to hear. It was probably just when I was about 16 and I started like hanging out with a lot of people older than me. And a lot of people were like, Martin never surfed. And it was like the common thing that people said is he didn't surf. He had a surfboard on his car. And then there was a bloke called Frank Daft who made his own homemade movie called Marty Don't Surf. And it's this weird kind of like 90s homemade horror course, like silly movie. But at the end, there's a woman in it, and in this movie they kill someone, and she takes off her jumper and she has this portrait of Martin Bryant on a t-shirt, and she goes, one of her mates goes, oh, who's that on your jumper? And she goes, it's Marty. You know Marty. He offed all those people. He had a surfboard on his car, but he didn't surf. And that was it. And I'm pretty sure Marty Don't Surf is on YouTube somewhere in the depths. You can probably find it. So, yeah. So that was what I started to understand. That was a bit of a thing that was around me. But, you know, my 16-year-old mind wasn't too interested in that at the time, you know. And then I started to talk about that. I was like, maybe Martin Bryant didn't do it. And then I met a bunch of people that I went to school with him. He used to draw pictures of animals getting killed. He's fucked in the head. He did it, you know. And then met someone else, and they're like, oh, he did this. I saw him in the bank, and he used to stare at me real weirdly all the time, you know. And I always felt real uncomfortable. And I heard about 4 or 5 of these sort of stories. And then in my mind, I was just like, oh, well, he did it. You know, he's fucked in the head. He fucking, you know, even like I've done stand-up comedy with a guy called Mick Davies. He grew up living next door to Martin Bryant. And they've actually interviewed him in some of the articles. And he's the one that said he used to talk to him about Nintendo games and Barbies. And apparently Martin used to also shoot all the birds in his tree. And, yeah, he was a good shot, you know. And this guy, through his lens and experience of understanding that, he thinks he did it, you know. So a lot of people had told me he fucking did it. He used to kill all the birds in the tree. He's a good shot. He was weird. He'd talk to kids about Nintendo games, or he'd stare at the woman weirdly in the bank, or he drew pictures of this in high school. You know, there's so many things I've been told over the years, like...
It's funny, they're the kind of things I did when I was a kid. Everyone had a slug gun back in the day, and you know, every summer they'd go through the bird population. There were some pretty good shots with those kids. And same thing, I used to festoon my homework with drawings of, you know, monsters and ghosts. Once again, and gore. And you know, people are looking at you like, oh, what's wrong with this kid? But it was a form of expression.
Yeah, it was
the 80s and 90s. Crazy nuts back then, and it
was Rambo. So, there was all these, you know, like you look at the culture of what it was.
The influences, you know.
Jason, you know, horror movies.
Was it abnormal, or was it just kids expressing themselves?
It was kids recycling what they were receiving.
Yeah.
It was really like they were receiving these images, Terminator, all these things.
Yeah, the 80s horror, all the 80s horror films were just basically slashes.
Exactly.
You know, where teenagers run off in the bush and get murdered.
Hyper-violent, you know. And that was a reality in Tassie back in the 80s. Some of the murders in Tassie in the 80s are fucking horrific. Jamie Curtis is like one of the worst situations I've ever heard of, and I won't repeat it, but yeah, like... Tasmania in the 80s and 70s, some of the murders and the stories worse than Wolf Creek, really are, you know, and so that shit was happening, you know what I mean? And when people ask me about Port Arthur, I was like, he did it. He was fucked in the head. I have 20 stories to tell you about how he was weird, you know, and it wasn't until I went to Perth for a rap battle, and I battled a guy called Cortex. And he asked me about it. And I told him the things I said. I repeated what everyone had told me. He did it, mate. He's fucked in the head. He's cooked, blah, blah, blah. And my mate goes, have you ever seen this interview? And I was like, who's it with? And he's like, it's a woman called Wendy Skerr. Yeah. And I was like, nah. And so I sat down and I watched Wendy Skerr's interview that she did in Canberra when Andrew McGregor took her up there and introduced her, and she spoke her truth. And I was so charmed by Wendy. I really was, because she was such, and rest in peace, God bless her. She is such a Tassie lady. Like the way that she speaks, the way that she carries herself, even the way she told the story about the Blunstons in that interview. She is such a Tasmanian country lady, like, and yeah, bless her heart, you know, like I've grown up around a lot of women like that, and they're good, just sincere people in the way that they carry themselves and their character and everything. And I think not only was I just like blown away by what she was saying, I really was charmed by, you know, I felt this kind of like she was a mum, you know what I mean? And this sort of kind of like, oh, she's a Tassie lady. And when she talked about how rough she'd been treated and all these things like that, I think I took it on board, you know, and I was like, nah. And that's what made me kind of maybe not dismiss at that time, you know. It was, yeah, it's definitely a cultural issue. And yeah, so after I saw the interview with Wendy, that's when I started to just deep dive, you know, and I started really looking into it. And I came back to Tassie, and I remember talking to people about it and getting shut down a lot. And I was like, but have you seen this interview? And I couldn't believe that someone in Perth showed me an interview from a Tasmanian woman about Port Arthur, but everyone back in Tassie was like, what? No, fuck off. No, like, just shut it. And so that was when I was like, I'm going to write a song about this. All my early influences of comedians and hip-hop artists from America speaking the truth about, you know, this stuff. I was like, I'm going to do a rap song about this, you know. And
what year was that you...
It was 2013 was when I started it. And I released a song in 2014 called Question of Guilt.
Let's give a welcome to Wendy Skerr.
I would like to thank the people of Inverell and the Forum Committee for inviting me here tonight to speak. If it hadn't have been for these people, I guess my story would never have been told. It certainly was never going to happen in Tasmania. So thank you. Port Arthur is a story of social engineering at its worst. This is the first time I have spoken in detail publicly of my experience at Port Arthur. Out of respect for those killed and their families, I decided my complete experiences should not be told. I am now convinced that our politicians, elected public servants and their offsiders in the bureaucracy have used this against me in their efforts to make sure that due legal process in relation to the Port Arthur Massacre never happens. I haven't anything to hide, I don't sleep well at night, but I hope after tonight there are a few more in the same position, and it's not you people. They know who they are.
In 1996, on April 28th, in Tasmania, Port Arthur was a fatal day. I know there are some memories that never fade away. A shock across the world when they were reading what the papers say. So what the papers say? On April 28th, the man with blonde hair walked into a cafe, carried a bag, opened up, grabbed a gun and then aimed at any men, women and children that got in his way. He didn't wait and moved on to a siege of the cottage. For 12 hours and he wasn't keeping the hostage. He waited, the place was setting fire to the coppers. He ran out and got caught and the cops got what they wanted, and he was sent straight to jail with no way to defend. He wasn't fit to stand trial, labelled, disabled and bent. He pleads guilty about 6 months later, and then the situation swept away and never talked about again. Martin Bryant had an IQ of 66, given the pen to consider mentally unfit. He couldn't function in public, dysfunctional kid. So was he capable of doing what they say what he did? So many killed in an instant, without even blinking. The most wounds were headshots, and he barely was missing. Reported to shoot from the hip when he turned to his victim. Skills of a soldier, quickly shooting them with perfect precision. There were many descriptions and reports that are told that he looked in his teens. He was nearly 30 years old. Said his face was scarred, riddled with pimples and moles, but Martin's face had clear skin with no pimples at all. And that siege at the cottage where he proceeded to go, decided to speak to the chief of police on the phone. And he was calm and collected, seemed to keep in his zone, but the noise in the back makes it hard to believe he's alone. And it was an hour away from the station to drive, but it took at least 3 hours for police to arrive. You would expect an inquest with all the people that died. To this day, many people still believe it's a lie, and I wonder why it took a while for every copper and politician missing denies, grin up with that crooked smile. A lot of info that they wouldn't file, while releasing his information to the nation before he stood a trial. Martin Bryant had an IQ of 66, given the pen to consider mentally unfit. He couldn't function in public, dysfunctional kid. So was he capable of doing what they say what he did? But if they're right and Martin did commit that killing spree, then why didn't the police investigate the inconsistencies? And for the victims and the families, the tragedy that swept away will change speculation to conspiracy. So you can leave if you want, or you can take it and listen. Either way, I'm not saying that I will change your opinion, but remember Martin today while he's staying in Risdon, wishing he wasn't locked away in a prison. And do some research when you listen to my verse. This information given's just the tip of the iceberg. There's still a lot left, don't consider a right turn, and use your own head. Within a minute you might learn.
Martin Bryant had an IQ of 66 and a mental age of 11. And I don't think he possibly could have carried it out in the 90 seconds to 2 minutes that the court says. I don't know where we go from here, but we need help. We need, as Australian citizens, we need to know the truth. I don't know whether we ever will, but we must have that coronial inquiry, not a royal commission. And because of the display of courage and bravery at Port Arthur on that terrible day, the injured victims who were alive when they were found survived.
And I won the Australian Hip Hop Song of the Year award for that song.
Okay.
Yeah, at the time there was a thing called ozhiphop.com, and they were doing awards, and yeah, I won an award for that song, which was very special to me because I kind of came up battle rapping, and everyone says battle rappers can't make music. So when I made a song and won that award, I was like, hey, you know, it showed you. But and even like looking back on the song, like musically, like it's just a song with truth in it. Like and I remember back then I wasn't comfortable enough to say what I thought. I just kind of was like, well, what about this? What about that? Like the whole song is just raising instant inconsistencies. You know, the first verse is about what they told us, and the second verse is like, but what about this? What about that? Shooting from the hip. You know, all the different things that don't add up. His IQ, all the stuff. And so I put that song out, and it really gained a lot of traction. A lot of the elders in the Australian hip hop scene really gave me a lot of respect for it. And
what about the general public? Was there?
Yeah, I mean, so at the time I was traveling Australia doing hip hop, so I'd find out what's going on the ground in every state, you know. And I went to Canberra and met a bunch of heads that lived in the ghetto flats just right on the edge of Canberra, and those guys were telling me a bunch of shit from Canberra in the 90s, you know. And the more that I spoke this sort of truth, it aligned me with people that were on their own, you know, journeys of truth for corruption that had happened in their areas and different stuff like that. But still in Tassie, a lot of people were just closed off to it. And then I went to a poetry event, like a slam poetry event in Hobart. And yeah, the guy headlining was a big slam poet from California that did it at Woodstock back in the day, you know, banging on drums. And somehow I ended up supporting him at a poetry event. And I spoke my song about Port Arthur in Hobart as a spoken word. And yeah, people started yelling. Like, people were like, you weren't there. You know, started, no, like, I disrupted the whole room, you know, and everyone was very disturbed by me just raising the inconsistencies once again. I wasn't going, it was or wasn't him. I'm like, but was he capable of doing what they say what he did? Which is one of the lines in the song. And people were just like, hey, you weren't there. Nah, just started fucking, I was like, whoa, true. You know, this is interesting. And then there was a couple times, like when I'd be out on the town in Hobart and someone who was drunk would come up to me and they'd just be like, fuck you. And I'd be like, what's going on? They're like, fucking, I know someone that died at Port Arthur. You're a fucking dog, blah, 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 you know? And I was just like, hey, like, don't you want answers as well, you know? But no one would ever have that conversation. If someone was like carrying that sort of energy, it was fuck off, shut down, you know what I mean? And so in the same sense of that, it's just that same sort of energy. And I was there like, hold on, you know, don't you want answers? You know what I mean? And
so all you were doing was asking questions, or, you know, just saying, look, something doesn't add up here, so I'm just raising the question.
It doesn't add up. And yeah, so, you know, my journey continued in regards for like searching for justice in different ways in my community. You know, I think I was very hyper-focused on Port Arthur for a while because, you know, when I put out the song, I got contacted by Wendy Sker's niece, and she actually hit me up and said, hey, my auntie's really grateful for your song, you know, and I was able to connect with her through that. And she was really grateful that I'd made this song and put it out there, and I'd sampled her interview at the start of my song, and I was just so honoured. I was pretty young as well. I was pretty naive and just immature young man in a lot of ways, you know, but yeah, I felt like I did something right, you know what I mean? But it's also a hard one, you know, I wasn't there, you know, I was very young when it happened, you know, but I'm very passionate once again about the truth, and, you know, so yeah, that was, in a nutshell, that was the journey with the song for that chapter of it, you know, and I'd kind of, in some ways, yeah, move forward, focusing on other situations in my life where my artistic intention was aimed at kind of this or that, you know. And it wasn't until 2019, where I ended up going into Risdon prison for a year, that all of this resurfaced. So in 2017, I was in an incident in North Hobart where I punched a guy for vandalising the pub. Ironic, I know, he's a graffiti artist, and yeah, I broke his jaw in 2 places. His name's Ian, and yeah, he was induced into a coma for a month and nearly lost his life. So I was charged with a grievous bodily harm charge and spent a year in Risdon prison, all up. And so yeah, when I got into Risdon, within like the first couple of days, an inmate came over to me and he goes, I love your music, bro. I love that song about Martin Bryant. I said, oh yeah? And he goes, yeah, man, I was just in Mersey with him for the last 2 months. So in Risdon prison, you've got a bunch of different units ranging from minimum to medium to maximum to super maximum, and the psych unit. And they're all named after different rivers in Tasmania. So the psych unit that Martin's in these days is called the Mersey unit, named after the Mersey River. And so, yeah, this inmate, he's like, I've just spent the last, 2 months with him, and I was like, okay, and he goes, yeah, he told me what he reckons happened. And I was like, phew, I've been in prison in a few days and this is kicking off, and yeah, long story short, and this narrative and this story has been told to me probably by about 5 or 6 people that have on and off spent enough time with Martin to play chess with him. He plays chess, and to find out what his side of the story is, I guess. Now, you have to understand that Martin Bryant brags about doing it. He brags about people didn't get, I got the most people, he's been bashed for years by so many different criminals in different ways for different reasons. Yeah, like I've got one mate that was playing a game of chess with him, got into an argument with him, and then Martin Bryant got a broom and pointed it at him like it was a gun. And then so he flogged him, and all sorts of different things. But the fella's been in there for 30 years. So yeah, I've heard so many different things, but from what I understand, his general narrative is that, he wasn't the shooter in the cafe, is that he was groomed by police from the age of 12 to be a part of it. He reckons he killed the Martins in the cottage. He reckons he killed the woman and her 2 daughters, but then he went straight back to the cottage. He refers to the guys in overalls. And apparently when he went to go meet the guys in overalls on the day, they had their AR-15 that, was given to him. He rocked up with a shotgun and they went, nah, and they gave him that. There's so many fucking details that, like, I've heard from so many different places in different ways, But yeah, I guess that kind of re-kicked off my interest with it, And yeah, and then also just being in Tasmania in prison for a year, I learned so much other elements of corruption. There's only one prison in Tassie, so everyone comes to the one jail, and I started to understand how the whole system is set up from inside down there. And
Did that open your eyes to, some of the people that were involved, during the Port Arthur Massacre from the police, that there were some questions about their level of integrity and honesty in regards to, their actions at Port Arthur on that day?
Yeah. I mean, I feel there's just so much healing that needs to happen in Tasmania. And even around this whole situation, there's been such an abuse of authority in Tasmania for so long, in every institution, whether it be Tasmanian police, whether it be the education department, most significantly the church, and it's in Tassie, in such a small place that was really built by Freemasons. If you look up the 1914 Encyclopedia of Freemasonry and you look up the history of the early years in Tasmania, the whole place was really built by Freemasons, as well as the institutions, the educational department. Tassie's one of a rare, unique place where the Anglican Church and the Freemasons seem to support each other. As far as I understand, there was always meant to be a separation of that, but there's public articles about Anglican priests being at Masonic ceremonies and graduations, and then there's just as much about high-level Freemasons being involved in the church. And then as well, you're looking at schools that are Anglican schools that are run by Freemasons. It's all so weirdly interconnected down there in every way. The judicial system, through the Royal Society. The Royal Society, is from England, and there was a Royal Society in Tasmania. Risdon Prison is technically still called Her Majesty's Risdon Prison. Like when you're in there and you get your documents, it's the Queen's prison. The integrity of the institutions across is questionable. And, from Ashley's detention centre, and that's all coming out now. Ashley's detention centre was the youth boys prison detention centre, and that has got such a dark history of abuse of authority. The gag laws in Tasmania that were changed by a woman called Grace Tame, who is one of the first people to ever come out and overcome the Tasmanian gag laws and speak her truth on the abuse that she went through a school called Collegiate. And the Collegiate school is connected to Hutchins, which is the oldest school in Australia. and a lot of the Tasmanian police, fucking everyone included, all went to this school. So, you know, it's a fucking hard one because the entire community is connected to these institutions. And there's a lot of good people through it all too. You know, it's so hard to kind of talk about this stuff in such a negative light when there are so many good people. You know, there are so many good people that work in the Tasmanian police and want to do good for the world, you know. And I know there was people like that back in the day too. But, yeah.
Mixing in the criminal fraternity when you're in Risdon and mixing with other criminals who would have a lot of inside knowledge about criminal activity in Tasmania.
Yeah.
What did you learn? What was the scope of what you learnt about what was going on?
I mean, I guess I think I learnt the most from being inside that the criminal issue in Tassie is a cultural one. And it's not, it doesn't matter what class you're in. You know, if you look at the history of how it was started, all the ships that rocked up had small amounts of soldiers but lots of convicts. You know, so the convicts took over pretty early, went and did their thing, bush ranging, all that sort of stuff. What I learned from my time in prison, and mind you, in the minimum section of Risdon Prison, they still have the Port Arthur convict lunch bell. So the original lunch bell that they used to ring back when my convict ancestors were in there 200 years ago is sitting on the main walkway in minimum in Risdon Prison today. And I used to tap it when I'd walk into the prison kitchen or work in the morning, you know. And from sitting inside Risdon Prison and looking at that Port Arthur lunch bell and understanding, especially a lot of my mates that have generationally been stuck in the system for generation upon generation, they're only fucking 7 generations down. Nothing's changed. The convict and criminal mentality is a cultural one. And the powers that be, and these people that have abused, and the people that have benefited off the oppression of others, they might be well-to-do in the eyes of society, but they're criminals just as much as the guys in Risdon are. You know, there's people in Tasmania doing time for drink driving when there's politicians that have gotten away with paying to have sex with a 12-year-old girl. Like the mayor of Glenorchy, Terry Martin, he was charged with paying to have sex with a 12-year-old girl who was getting pimped out by her father, a guy who was a locally known criminal in Tassie called Gary Devine. And even when the mayor of Glenorchy, Terry Martin, got charged with that, there was 100 other people, and it was suggested it was police officers, other politicians, you know, all sorts that did this, but they all got off. And Terry Martin got charged, but he got a 6 months suspended sentence because he was on medication that made him hypersexual. Wow. And he got charged and he disappeared, changed his name. Who knows where he's gone now, you know? And that happened in 2010. So I was 21 when that happened, you know? Like, I can go through so many situations that have happened in the community in Tasmania where it's like, what the fuck? You know, how does this make sense?
So there were these pretty high-profile cases involving pedophilia with very powerful people.
Yeah.
But there was no repercussions from that. No one went to jail, and it wasn't.
No, there wasn't. And the only way I can answer that when I'm watching people go to jail for, you know, I'm in jail for breaking someone's jaw. This guy's in jail for drink driving. This guy's in jail for sending a threatening text message. This guy's in jail for fucking getting on the crack and stealing the car and driving over. You know what I mean? Like, you're sitting there going through... Yeah, really. Like, robbing the servo down the road. Like, most of the guys in there, so much generational trauma. They've got meth addiction issues. And they're doing petty, desperate crime. Petty, desperate crime. That is dangerous and hurts people, don't get me wrong. And I'm not standing up for any of it, you know. But it's very interesting when you realise, like, the detriment that sexual abuse has to the community and the person, and how lightly that crime was treated, you know, throughout the Tasmanian judicial system. And so the only way I can answer this is there must be corruption. There must be, how is this, you know, like, it's, it doesn't make sense. And then, yeah, the more I the more I talk to people, and this is the thing, everyone knows the truth down there. Everyone knows, everyone knows this truth, and everyone's scared to talk about it. Whether they know about Joe Gilovich, whether they know about Terry Martin, whether they know about Port Arthur, whether they know about fucking all these situations that all weirdly intercept institutionally and through the community. They're all connected somehow, you know. There's a story about police corruption in Tassie that I learnt from inside minimum prison, because there's a write-up on the wall by an old criminal called Mickey Marlowe about one of his friends who was a guy called Dennis Carr. And these guys were a part of the original Risdon crew in the old Tassie crime days. And from what I understand, way before my time, but a bunch of crims bought a town in Tassie that was an old tin mining town, and the houses were like $100
What's
bucks
the name
each.
of that town? I think I've heard of this.
Risdon.
I have heard about Risdon. I've heard that it's still a place that it's you go there and people that have come out of prison or people with a dark past go and live in Risdon, and it's one of those places you've got to be a little careful when you venture in there.
Yeah, well, you know, I think it's all right these days. I think, yeah, and I know people that go up there for holidays and it's pretty quiet and it's all good. But this is, you know, back in the day, and this crew had a beef with the Launceston police. So back in this day and age, police wrote the statements. They were like, oh, do the interview, and then they wrote down what you said. So they could control everything. Oh, you want to admit? Oh, you admitted to robbing the Harvey Norman. You admitted to this. There you go. There's 10 years. See you later. You know. And so apparently they did this with Dennis Carr. He had like a beef with the main copper in town. You know, and he went down to town and he got a microphone and stood on the back of his truck and spoke out the front of the Launceston police about how they were corrupt. And then they've gone, oh, yeah, no worries. So you admit to this crime, there's 10 years jail. And so Dennis Carr, from inside minimum in Risdon prison, took it to the High Court of Australia and was able to, get it all sorted out. So the reason they started recording statements in Australian police history is because of that situation with Dennis Carr in Tasmania.
So that set the precedent for, well, you can't just trust the police to do that. You need an independent.
Yeah, you need to
be able
record the
write your own
statement.
witness and then sign it and
exactly
so on, which is interesting because with Port Arthur, and I was speaking to Stephen Howard, who was an employee there who had a tragic loss, and he remembers that he wrote a very detailed statement and gave it to the police, and when he got it back, it was very much bridged and cut. Wow. And he was pretty traumatised at the time. He didn't think much of it, but he was surprised that he thought that when you write a statement, your words are your words.
Yeah.
But it came back with a lot of his
edited
original testimony edited out and cut out.
Yeah, that's crazy because that was the 90s. And Dennis Carr was like years before that. You know what I mean? Like,
when you're in Risdon, I assume you didn't have any interactions with Martin. You never got to meet him, did you?
No, not personally. I could see him from the landing in Burberry, which is one of the units in Medium. You can see the exercise yard of Mersey.
Yeah.
But I spent a month in Huon, which is an identical unit to Mersey. And so, yeah, I would have been like, I guess about 6 metres away from him on the other side of the concrete. And, yeah, but most of the time I spent was with people that have known him, you know, and there's some people that thinks that he wasn't a part of it all, but there's a lot of people that thinks that he did, you know. I know guys that are like really triggered by everyone saying that he's innocent because these guys were in jail with him when he'd brag about doing things, you know. So there's a lot of guys that when they see all these comments going, Martin's innocent, they're like, no, he's fucking not. You know, just because he might not have been capable of it all, but he hasn't carried himself with integrity in regards to it. You know, there's people that hold that feeling and have that experience with him personally as to why they still think that. And I can't tell them any different, you know, like everyone is entitled to their own opinion.
His character's interesting. People, as you said, they play chess. I had one inmate say he wasn't an easy beat as a chess player, which is interesting because, you know, the general regard is that he was a very low IQ, that he wasn't very intelligent. But to play chess and to be someone with any degree of, I suppose it's a skill you can learn, but it suggests a certain amount of intelligence.
Yes, I mean, it's also, in the 90s, we didn't understand the autism spectrum very much at all. And Tasmania has a history of not really understanding autism. Like, even recently, people down there need to go to Sydney to get diagnosed properly with ASD and autism and stuff like that. So, yeah, and that's a deep conversation in regards to mental health, historical inbreeding, all sorts of different shit, that I feel that that's deeply connected to in so many ways. But, yeah, autism is such a rare and different neurodivergent disorder in so many ways that people can be very uncoordinated, struggle with speech, come across as a very low-functioning human, but then be a master at chess, like the Rain Man guy that, could remember everything, it's... and don't get me wrong, I think there's probably an element of, Martin that is very intelligent underneath it all, and once again, who knows how damaged he really is now compared to what he was before of all this in regards to the institutionalisation. I was in an identical cell to him for a month, and it was lockdowns 3 weeks. It was completely locked down at least 3 weeks out of the month because of staff issues. Like, there wasn't enough staff at the prison to let us out for human rights acceptable amount of time. Some days we go 4 days locked down in a 2x4 cell without our laundry getting done, and you've only got 2 pairs of jocks and clothes, so there's basic human rights being broken on a daily fucking thing down there, but there's just no staff, or then like half of the staff go on compo leave and stress leave, or half of the staff that work in that prison are dodgy, just trying to fucking go in and something happen and get a payout. I know of guards saying to criminals, come on, break my jaw, go your halves in the payout. You know what I mean? Like, it's...
Were there brutal guards there?
Yeah, there were. I generally avoided them, and there were good guards there too. I've run into guards that don't work in Risdon anymore. But, I made the most of my time in Risdon prison. I wrote an album called Risdon Wisdom. I did a concert. I did a rap battle. And I really tried to empower other inmates, I really am passionate about doing good, and sometimes in the past I would make mistakes and act out when things weren't going the way I thought they were meant to, and I had a really like a sheriff mentality. And I guess that's why I've held on to this knowledge for so long, because there is a part of me and my character and my identity that has we need to sort out the problem sheriff mentality. But unfortunately, that would get me in hot water through making mistakes and, different other stuff like that, because I'd be caring a bit too much in the wrong ways and applying my energy to the situation in an incorrect fashion, But I love life, and, I love to shine light, and it pains me with how much darkness is in the world, and with how much people and all these situations are holding on to their darkness and then passing it on to others because they're not healing and they're not letting go of this sort of stuff. So I'll have the best time in the darkest of places, you know what I mean? Because I choose to walk that path of light and look for God in every situation, But, yeah, man.
It's always a bit of a fight,
I
imagine. It's just not an easy thing, and I guess you've got your history, your past. You get the impression, since I started investigating Port Arthur, that, anyone that does that, your name's, black down in Tasmania. But then I'm also getting a lot of people saying that there are a lot of people in Tasmania that know that Port Arthur stinks.
Yeah.
What's your impression there? What's the general consensus of the population about Port Arthur?
Yeah, I feel that everyone just knows. And that's the thing, like, it's more rare these days to talk to someone that goes, no, you know what I mean? Everyone knows it stinks. Everyone knows it stinks. And everyone knows everything stinks. You know what I mean? It's so, maybe people aren't talking to each other as much as they should be. But, you know, as someone, I guess I'm a popular person, and I meet a lot of people, and a lot of people connect with my music and share their story with me, you know. And I feel that a lot of people down there says it stinks. The people that that are certain that, you know, what they say happened, are people that are, affected by the trauma of it on a deeper level, that they don't want to look back, you know. And once again, talking about the cultural issues in Tassie of healing and shutting things down and not looking back. Let's just move forward. Don't look back. Don't look back. You know. There are people with that attitude, but I know there are so many people that think differently. You know. And there's people that, you know, I know. Wendy Skur has families. There's all those people have their families. There's generations of people my age and even younger that it was their aunties or their grandparents or, you know, that were negatively affected by this in a deeper level of legal process of law not happening, you know. And it really seems the more that they shut it down, and they're still just trying to, you know. Daily Mail is writing articles rapidly now about how it was Martin. Even when they released the footage to 60 Minutes, it was so confusing, because it was like, all right, no, we can't release the court documents for 90 years, but here's a bit of the interview. Oh, here's a bit more of this. Here's a bit more of that. And it's just like, well, make your fucking mind up. If you're going to shut it down, shut it down. Don't just keep drip feeding us more proof that it was him. You know what I mean? It's very confusing. And I
did the interviews on Sam Newman's podcast, you know, the Daily Mail came out, and their response was vitriolic, like nasty almost, and deliberately lied, changed the words. It literally did the equivalent of will make can't, and changed the whole context. And you think, I get it that, you know, people can dissent on an argument, but why this kind of total almost hatred of anyone that dares to ask a question? And I just don't understand that. And I had another article with the Tasmanian Times. Same thing. You know, they printed one of the Tasmanian senators who was standing for a seat with the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party was calling for, Philip Bigg was calling for a coronial inquest. He's a Tasmanian. He was running for there. And we put out a press release, and it was basically ripped to pieces by commenters on the Tasmanian Times. And so I responded, and they just literally censored the response and just said, oh, we just cut out all the waffle. And you just think, that's not your job. Your job is to report the news.
Yeah, it's journalism, you know. And I think, the Tasmanian Times, I've definitely checked on their stuff, and I know that someone to do with that, that journalism, or for whatever that is, I remember reading something about them knowing someone that saw Martin kill someone on the day. And I guess this is, the hard bit, is that you have people that swear that they saw him, you know. You have people that swear it wasn't him. You know, there's just so much, you know. And from what I understand, it seems that, you know, he was involved in it. It seems that he did murder people on the day. I'm not sure if, he was the guy in the cafe, or, you know, there's lots of other things that don't add up. But it really seems that, it's just, you know, and I've really taken into consideration all the internet conspiracy angle of everything. You know, I really try and question that as much as I question media, everything. I really try and not just, I read this and this, you know, and really try and break it down. And it just seems that all the vitriol, all that negative reaction is a knee-jerk energy shift coming from a guilty place, coming from a place of shutting down. You know, on my own healing journey, all trauma that I went through, I had to process it and get it out. it's all about letting the darkness come out to the light, where all these people are like, nah, keep it down, and that generationally affects us whether we like it or not, So I hope that answers the question.
29 years ago, it's been 29 years since that day, and there is, my understanding is there's been a shift in the old guard, if you like, particularly amongst some of the police that were around at the time, and that now there's in essence a new breed, as you would imagine there would be, of police in Tasmania. What are your general impressions, without naming names, of the old guard police that were around at the time of Port Arthur 29 years ago, but also, in essence, policing Tasmania back then?
Yeah, I mean, it comes with a lot of stories, a lot of hearsay, different things like that. It seems like right now, and over the last 5 years, there has been a radical movement within the police in Tasmania of holding people accountable for their actions over the past. It's just hard. It's from me and my perspective, it's all tied in with the same behaviour I saw in the old guard of Tasmania in general. Whether it's the police, it's the church, it's the institutions, it's the same sort of people, the same disconnection from elite to society. I don't know. Yeah, all the different sort of.
So being for a while in your life, while you were growing up in troubled times, you were in essence on the wrong side of the track. So therefore, you would have had a unique perspective on dealing with criminality and the judicial process and the power players from the point of view of being someone that had fallen outside of the law, which gives you a fairly unique perspective that a lot of other people wouldn't have.
100%. And, Australian law is very interesting in the way that it's all based on maritime and, all these different, the way that they structure it. And it's even understanding that from an outsider perspective, or guess being part of it, definitely helped me just see the powers that be trying to control, and from what I understand about law, there's the law of the universe, the law of the land, there's the law of spirit. There's so many different elements of what law is. And I guess the laws that were created in Tassie to suppress stuff, gag laws, all sorts of different shit that got in the way of the truth being told. And the thing is, when the truth hasn't been told, it repeats. If we don't know our history, doomed to repeat it, and the irony of the history in Tasmania with the massacres that happened down there, and then Port Arthur being the place that this massacre occurred in modern times, which once again is, crazy when you think about the Coniston Massacre in 1926.
What was that massacre? Tell us about that.
So the Coniston Massacre was 1926, and it was up in Northern Territory, where a man, as far as I understand, he was an ex-soldier. He came back from war. They made him a Northern Territory police officer, and he ended up murdering, allegedly, about 150 Aboriginal people. It was over. I can't remember the exact details, but there'd been a complication over between white and Indigenous people over maybe hunting or something like that. This copper went out and ended up massacring. Yeah, I think he only reported like 20 or 30, but it was a lot more than that.
It was one person who done this.
As far as I know, the Coniston Massacre, 1926. The man on the $2 coin is the survivor of that massacre. The Indigenous elder on the $2 coin is apparently the one survivor of the Coniston Massacre. So 1926, which is less than 100 years ago. So, when Port Arthur happened in 1996, it's only 70 years. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people that are alive when Port Arthur happened were alive when the Coniston Massacre happened. But that happened off up in the desert away from where, the colony was. So it was just kind of forgotten about more and more. So there we get back to how comfortably in Australia we can be like, oh, that was a while ago, you know. In 70 years, they're going to say the Port Arthur was a while ago. You know what I mean? And
I've never heard of this previous massacre of 1926 until you told me. So that's astounding that a police officer can kill that many.
Yeah, so there we go.
And it's not common knowledge on history.
Yeah.
So there you go. You're right.
But yet it's on our $2 coin. You know what I mean? Like the story of the Coniston Massacre is in the pocket of every person around this country. But yet, you know, and I guess in the same way that I look at things in the system in the colony and I see these things come out, I can see parallels and correlations from that situation to this, you know.
The latest police commissioner, I understand, is cleaning house, so to speak.
Seems like it. Yeah, Donna Adams. And it seems that she has been on a mission to regain the faith between Tasmanian police and the community by dealing with some of this stuff, you know. And once again, names don't get mentioned until police officers have committed suicide, like what happened with Paul Reynolds.
What was the situation with that individual?
So what I understand, Paul Reynolds was a Northern Tasmanian police officer who was there in Port Arthur on the day that the massacre happened. But a few years ago, I think it was 2018, he was being investigated for like 30 years of sexual abuse, and then he ended up committing suicide right as he was being investigated. And then they put the documents just in a box in the cop station for a few years until 2022, when I think another copper might have committed suicide, and then they started looking into it, and they're like, hold on, there's been 4 police officers that have committed suicide over the last 10 years, what's happening, you know? And it seemed like the narrative that they were kind of painting was like, oh, this is all from, you know, trauma they've witnessed in the force. But it seems to me that, a lot of it comes from trauma that these guys have done. Like, you know, they've abused their authority and they've caused trauma for people, and that's what they're hiding from.
Like child sexual abuse and so on.
Yeah. Well, this is, you know, the narrative that definitely is the majority of the one that reaches the public the most, is that, there's been a massive abuse issue, a lot to do with sexual abuse, you know. When you understand the history of the Ashley's Boys Detention Centre, a lot of the guys my age that grew up in Ashley's were all abused, you know. Like, as a kid on the street, if you got locked up, you came back different, you know. That was just how it kind of was. And, you know, they've been doing the Royal Commission over the last few years, and I've been watching lots of people I know getting payouts for what they went through in different, you know, institutions. And once again, you know, like some of my good friends that have been through the worst in Ashley's were completely ignored by the government, ignored by media, ignored by everything, you know. And it's the only person I've really seen stand up for institutional sexual abuse in Tasmania as an individual was Grace Tame. And she won Australian of the Year after speaking up against, she was groomed by one of her teachers at the school collegiate, which once again is all tied into a pretty small sector of a community of people in Hobart, you know. And even the guy that abused Grace Tame, and he was bragging about it on social media afterwards, like, oh, I did what you all want to do, you know. And I was like, hold on, how is this cunt this comfortable to talk like this? You know, in my world, if someone bragged about, you know, grooming a teenager, they get flogged. But obviously this guy is from an environment where this shit is that acceptable, that he thinks it's that normal to brag about doing this on social media, and that's what everyone wants to do.
Was that person ever charged, prosecuted? Or?
Yeah, he was. I can't remember his name. But big shout outs to Grace Tame. She's a hero in so many ways. And she really is leading the way for speaking truth when it comes to institutional abuse of authority, you know, or abuse of whatever your position is when you're doing that shit, you know.
It's
and,
very important to me that relating to Port Arthur, which is my own personal journey to find answers.
Yeah.
So the whole point is not to glorify Martin Bryant. It's not to dump rubbish on anyone. It's to simply get answers and to find a level of truth.
Yeah.
The reason this is pertinent to the culture of Tasmania itself, which is a very insular place and a very contained place, is that once you begin to become aware that there is a fairly cancerous core to a lot of the governing authorities of that state, it really basically draws attention to the underside of that state and makes you question why things occur and why there could be very powerful players involved in that. It gives some credibility to the notion that not everyone who's in charge is going to be a kind, benevolent, truthful, honest and person of integrity. That some people will be out there, for all kinds of nefarious and sinister reasons, and that because they're in charge of a relatively small community, you're going to get a cancer at the core of it.
Well, power corrupts, and humans, born with sin in that sense of like, yeah, when shit gets isolated and there's too much power, it's very hard for it not to corrupt, especially in the patriarch. I think a lot of these issues are patriarchal when it comes to like, boys' clubs, private gentlemen's clubs, Freemasons, institutions that are all run by men. That's where a lot of this power and corrupt and abuse and all this shit comes into it. If you look at matriarchal societies that were ruled by women and men were the hunters and providers, it worked a lot differently, So I feel that there's so many elements of what goes into the psyche that ends up with these situations being possible, and it's all intertwined within everything, I guess. When you look at the culture of what can happen when, Lord of the Flies. Like even I see Tasmania as a big Lord of the Flies. You know what I mean? And people only snapped out of it when someone else rocked up. Like, hold on. What have we just been doing? William Crowther, stealing skulls, all this sort of stuff. Like, these were elite men in the colony. And because all the ships that came out had 5 women to every 100 men, we're talking about an island that was ran by men. The rape that was gone down there with Indigenous was so prolific because the only women that got sent to the colony were married to the soldiers. So what do you think the convicts were doing? You're talking about a deep cultural issue down there of so much suppression of learnt behaviours generationally, whether it be, once again, my mates that are still in Risdon, or whether it be, the kids of Freemasons that are going to Hutchins and kids of coppers, they're dealing with their own generational trauma. Even when I try to understand the Tasmanian police and what they could have done to cause trauma on society, I think about what the trauma they had to deal with. Are the same cops that dealt with, the Port Arthur Massacre, the same cops that dealt with Jamie Curtis and what happened there, which was a horrific fucking murder.
What's the Jamie Curtis story?
Just a very, very dark murder. Really horrible about it. Yeah, a guy and his younger brother murdering a young couple up in the bush. Very, Wolf Creek level fucking savage shit. But that was a very prolific murder, and I grew up with the cousin of the guy that was murdered. And I grew up with the children of Joe Gilovich. Joe Gilovich was a man that was shot by Tasmanian police in 1991, and they tried to say that he was a traumatised Vietnam veteran that acted out and was shooting at them, so they shot him dead, But there's a lot of different narratives. There's a book that's been written about Joe Gilovich, by a guy who could see that they were not following legal process, and it seemed like a situation where they were trying to cover up stuff, I spoke to Joe Gilovich's kids who I went to school with, and they're still looking for answers. Everyone's looking for answers, and everyone is scared to ask for answers, and that's fucked up. Like, even if, something bad happened with your dad and the cops and shit, if you're a police and you're here to protect and serve your community, which is what it's meant to fucking be, why can't we have answers? Why can't we have healing? Why can't we have the truth? And the truth will set you free. And I know that there's got to be people that are covering their shit up, but I know that this darkness is chasing them just as much. And yeah, I mean, bless if you can fucking twist the narrative and whatever. You know, your journey is between you and God at the end of the day when it comes down to your own sins, you know. But we need truth, and the more that we try to fucking cover shit up, and we all should know this as individuals, let alone collectively as a society, that the more you try and cover your shit up, the more it comes back to bite you in the ass. And that's what's happening right now with the Port Arthur Massacre, is because it wasn't handled properly, it wasn't explained properly, and they tried to shut it all down. And here we are, 29 years later, doing a podcast about it. You know, and people are like, why are you still talking about it? If they had done their job properly, we would not be talking about it, you know? And it's as simple as that. That's really it at the end of the day. And yeah, I don't know where it's going to go from here. You know, I hope there is a path of truth and, you know, everything just people understanding and accepting and realising, you know.
You're a walking example as an artist that's come from, in many ways, a very black path that could have taken you down another way, and have, you know, risen above that, become quite a celebrity artist in many ways, a very important artist with a positive message and a connection with God as well. And so I guess, you know, I just want to finish up by saying where you are at the moment now, and how do you feel and where do you want to go, having come out of that?
Oh yeah, where I go from here is I just want to share light, share love, and encourage healing. Because as an artist in the world that I come from, and in the world that everyone comes from, we need healing more than ever. The world's in a tough spot, you know, it's in a very tough spot. And yeah, we just really need healing. And I just want to contribute to the world in a positive way that hopefully can encourage, yeah, just people finding their truth, people healing, letting go of all that shit and finding unity. That's what's so important to me, you know. And I do feel that all lies will be exposed. I've lied in my life. I've lied, I've cheated, I've done things, and it all will be exposed. It doesn't matter who you are, you know, and that's it at the end of the day. And I just want to thank God for the blessing of having this perspective, you know, and I just give it to God. And God will do the work with this, I really feel. That's the light, you know, and I just encourage everyone to speak their truth and follow their light. And yeah,
where can people find Greeley now if they want to?
I'm on all the things.
Message?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Spotify, I'm on YouTube. You'll see me everywhere. I'm in the zeitgeist of Australian shit, you know what I mean? And I'm here, and I'm going to speak my truth, and I'm going to keep doing what I do, you know. And yeah, but I just like I feel empathy for everyone. And I understand learnt behaviour, and I understand the cycle and how things repeat. And I had to break the cycle of my own personal life to understand this. And from the beginning of what Tasmania is, Van Diemen's Land, to what happened with William Lanny and Truganini and the Athenaeum Club and William Crowther and these scientists and the Boys Club, and, you know, all tied in with Freemasonry science and the medicine department, you know, fucking all these things, you know. It's left a lot of the world, it's benefited off a lot of the world's downfall, you know, all of it. And yeah, man, I just want to see it all come to the light and keep sharing my light every day. And yeah.
Well, that's what you're doing. I mean, the message you've reached a lot of people. So
yeah, bless.
You know, and I really do want to thank you for coming.
No, I thank you, man, and I thank you for your bravery. I really thank you for your bravery for doing this, because yeah, it shouldn't be risky. You know, I've been looking on social media, and I saw Michael Dyson even say in the comments, all questions should be answered, you know, and him being a police officer that's always been heavily involved around this topic, you know, he's right. All questions do need to be answered. And, yeah, I just pray for truth. That's it.
We'll get there.
Yeah. God bless you, man.
You too. Thanks, man.
Thank you, bro.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Wasp Files. New episodes will be uploaded every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Feel free to share far and wide, and please see the links to the Dropbox files and information relating to the episodes. Also, without any obligation, please see the Buy Me a Coffee campaign, which helps keep the channel running and also provides profits to my friends who are survivors from Port Arthur who have supported me on this journey. Thank you.